The rain came down in relentless sheets, hammering the tin roof of Grandma Eleanor's cottage like 1,000 tiny fists. It was June 28, 1995, a date that would carve itself into her memory with the precision of a blade. The small house, nestled on the edge of Willow Creek, a quiet town in rural Ohio, seemed to groan under the weight of the storm. The windows rattled in their frames, and the wind howled through the gaps in the old wooden siding, as if nature itself were mourning the loss that had just shattered Eleanor's world. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and lavender, a futile attempt to mask the inevitability of death. Eleanor sat by the bed, her hands clasped around Thomas's, his skin paper-thin and cool to the touch. Her husband of 40 years was slipping away, his breath shallow and uneven, each one a fragile thread tethering him to life. The hospice nurse, a kind woman named Margaret with soft gray eyes, had left the room to give them privacy. "It won't be long now," Margaret had whispered earlier, her voice gentle but firm, as if preparing Eleanor for the finality of it all. Eleanor's gray hair, once a vibrant auburn, was pulled back in a loose bun, strands escaping to frame her tired face. Her eyes, a deep hazel, were red-rimmed from days of sleepless vigil. She wore a faded blue cardigan over a simple cotton dress, the same one she'd worn when Thomas proposed to her on a spring evening in 1955, under a sky so clear it seemed the stars were within reach. The dress was a quiet rebellion against the grief threatening to swallow her, a reminder of joy, of love, of a life built together. Thomas's chest rose and fell, each breath a labored effort. His face, once rugged and handsome, was now gaunt, etched with the lines of illness. Cancer had stolen his strength, but not his spirit. Even in his final days he'd managed a weak smile, his blue eyes twinkling as he teased Eleanor about her terrible cooking. "You burned the roast again, Ellie," he'd rasped yesterday, his voice barely audible. She'd laughed through her tears, promising to make him his favorite apple pie when he got better, both of them knowing it was a promise she couldn't keep. Their life together had been simple but rich. They'd met at a county fair when Eleanor was 19, her laughter catching Thomas's attention as she tripped over a hay bale during a square dance. He'd caught her arm, steadying her, and from that moment, they were inseparable. They married a year later, built this cottage with their own hands, raised their daughter Clara, and weathered every storm life threw at them. Droughts that killed crops, winters that tested their resolve, and now this, the cruelest blow of all. Eleanor leaned closer, brushing a lock of white hair from Thomas's forehead. "You're still the handsomest man I know," she whispered, her voice cracking. She wanted to say more, to tell him how he'd been her anchor, her laughter, her home. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with the fear of what came next. She'd never lived a day without him in her heart, even before they met. How was she supposed to do it now? The clock on the bedside table ticked softly, its hands creeping toward midnight. The storm outside grew fiercer, lightning flashing through the thin curtains, casting fleeting shadows across the room. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the photographs on the wall, a black and white snapshot of their wedding day, Clara's first birthday, a trip to Lake Erie where Thomas had taught her to fish. Each image was a stitch in the tapestry of their life, now unraveling with every labored breath Thomas took. She squeezed his hand, willing him to hold on, though she knew it was selfish. He was tired, so tired. The cancer had spread to his lungs, his bones, his everything. The doctors had given him months, then weeks, then days. Now it was hours, maybe minutes. Eleanor's heart ached with the weight of it, a physical pain that radiated from her chest to her fingertips. She wanted to scream, to beg the universe to give them one more day, one more hour. But she stayed silent, her love for him stronger than her despair. "Ellie," Thomas whispered, his voice a faint thread of sound. Her eyes snapped to his, hope flaring despite herself. His lips moved again, barely forming the words. "You're tougher than you know." She choked back a sob, pressing his hand to her cheek. "Don't you leave me, Thomas Miller," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears streaming down her face. "Not yet." But his eyes, those clear blue eyes that had always seen her, were growing distant. His chest rose once, twice, then stilled. The room was silent, save for the rain and the ticking clock. Eleanor sat frozen, waiting for another breath that never came. She pressed her forehead to his hand, her tears falling onto his skin, and whispered, "I love you." The world broke then. splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Time lost its shape, minutes stretching into eternity as she sat there, unwilling to let go. She didn't hear the door open, didn't notice the cold air rushing in until a shadow loomed over her. Eleanor. The voice was sharp, cutting through her grief like a knife. She looked up, startled, to see Richard, Thomas's younger brother, standing in the doorway. His coat was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes burned with something raw and unreadable. Richard was 10 years younger than Thomas, a man of 45 with a broad frame and a temper that had always simmered just below the surface. He'd never been close to Eleanor, always keeping her at arm's length with his brusque manner and sharp tongue. But he was family, and Thomas had loved him, so Eleanor had tolerated his presence. "Richard," she said, her voice hoarse. She wiped her tears with the sleeve of her cardigan, trying to compose herself. He's gone." Richard's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He stepped into the room, his boots leaving muddy prints on the hardwood floor. "You let him die," he said, his voice low and venomous. Eleanor flinched, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "What? You heard me," he snapped, taking another step closer. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with something dangerous. "You were supposed to take care of him. You let him waste away in this prison of a house." The accusation was absurd, cruel, but it landed on Eleanor's raw grief like salt on a wound. She stood, her legs shaky, and faced him. "I did everything I could," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "The doctors, the nurses, they all said there was nothing more to be done. You know that, Richard." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made her skin crawl. "Nothing more? You gave up on him. You sat here, playing the devoted wife while he suffered." His voice rose, filling the small room, drowning out the rain. He was close now, too close, his breath hot and sour with whiskey. Eleanor took a step back, her hip bumping against the bedside table. The lamp wobbled, casting frantic shadows. "Richard, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't the time. He's gone. Let's just grieve him together." But Richard wasn't listening. His grief had twisted into something darker, something that had been festering for years. Eleanor had always sensed his resentment, toward her, toward Thomas, toward the life they'd built without him. Thomas had been the golden son, the one who'd made something of himself, while Richard drifted from job to job, town to town, nursing grudges like wounds. "You don't get to tell me how to grieve," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "You never deserved him. You never understood what he needed." The words stung, but it was his hands that hurt more. He grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh through the thin cardigan. Eleanor gasped, instinctively trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. "Richard, stop!" she cried, her voice breaking. He didn't stop. His rage boiled over and he shoved her hard. She stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall with a thud that knocked the breath from her lungs. Pain flared in her spine, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped her as Richard advanced, his eyes wild with something she didn't recognize. Grief, yes, but also a deep, unhinged fury. "You think you're so perfect," he spat, his voice slurring now. "Always the good wife. Always the one everyone loves. But you failed him, Eleanor. You failed him." She tried to speak, to reason with him, but he was beyond reason. His hand lashed out, striking her across the face. The force of it sent her reeling, her cheek burning as she tasted blood. She caught herself on the edge of the bed, her hands grasping at the quilt Thomas had loved, the one they'd wrapped around themselves on cold winter nights. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice small, her body trembling. But he was a storm now, unstoppable. He grabbed her again, his hands rough and cruel, and threw her to the floor. Her knees hit the hardwood and pain shot through her legs. She tried to crawl away, toward the door, toward safety, but he was on her in an instant, his weight pinning her down. The next moments were a blur of pain and fear. His fists, his words, his anger, they merged into a single suffocating force. Eleanor's world narrowed to the sharp sting of each blow, the coppery taste of blood in her mouth, the sound of her own ragged breaths. She didn't know how long it lasted, seconds, minutes, an eternity. All she knew was the cold floor beneath her, the rain pounding outside, and the distant memory of Thomas's voice, telling her she was tougher than she knew. When Richard finally stopped, his chest heaving, his face flushed with exertion, he stood over her, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the lamp. "You're nothing without him," he said, his voice cold now, empty of the rage that had fueled him. He turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him, leaving Eleanor alone in the wreckage. She lay there, curled on the floor, her body aching, her dress torn and stained with blood. The rain continued its assault on the cottage, but inside the silence was deafening. Thomas was gone. Richard had taken something else from her, her safety, her dignity, her sense of self. But as she lay there, something stirred within her, faint but undeniable. It was the spark of the woman Thomas had always believed in, the one who'd survived hard winters and harder losses. She wasn't broken, not completely. Not yet. Eleanor pushed herself up, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the bed. Blood dripped from a cut on her lip, staining the quilt, but she didn't care. She crawled to the bedside table, her fingers fumbling for the photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. She clutched it to her chest, her tears falling onto the glass, and whispered, "I'm still here, Thomas. I'm still here." The storm raged on, but Eleanor's heart, battered and bruised, began to beat with a new rhythm. Not of defeat but of defiance. She didn't know how she'd move forward, didn't know how she'd face the days ahead. But she knew one thing. She would not let Richard's cruelty define her. She was Eleanor Miller, and she was tougher than she knew. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world outside Eleanor's cottage slick and heavy, as if the earth itself were grieving. The sky hung low, a dull gray blanket that smothered the sunlight, casting the small Ohio town of Willow Creek in a muted haze. Inside the cottage, the air was stale, thick with the scent of wilted flowers and the faint metallic tang of blood that Eleanor hadn't yet scrubbed from the floor. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the coffee inside long gone cold. Her eyes, red and swollen from a night of silent weeping, stared blankly at the grain of the wooden table, tracing the familiar knots and scratches that told the story of her life with Thomas. It was June 29, 1995, the first day of a world without him. Eleanor's body ached, her knees bruised from where she'd fallen, her shoulders sore from Richard's grip, her cheek tender where his hand had struck. The physical pain was a dull roar, but it was the weight in her chest that threatened to crush her. Grief and shame tangled together, a suffocating knot that made every breath feel like a betrayal. Thomas was gone, and Richard had left her broken, bloodied, and alone. Yet the world outside kept moving. Birds chirped, cars rumbled down the dirt road. Life marched on as if nothing had changed. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the mug, her knuckles whitening. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't even changed out of the torn cotton dress she'd worn the night before. The fabric, once a soft blue, was now stained with dirt and blood, a silent testament to Richard's cruelty. She'd meant to wash it, to erase the evidence of that night, but her body refused to move. It was as if her grief had anchored her to the chair, chaining her to this moment of loss and violation. The cottage, once a haven of warmth and love, felt like a stranger's house. The walls, lined with photographs and mementos of her life with Thomas, seemed to mock her. There was the black and white picture from their wedding day, Eleanor's smile radiant as Thomas spun her on the dance floor. There was Clara's 5th grade school photo, her gap-toothed grin a mirror of her father's. There was the snapshot from their last vacation, a trip to the Smoky Mountains where Thomas had insisted on hiking despite his weakening body. Each image was a stab, a reminder of what she'd lost. Not just Thomas, but the safety she'd taken for granted. She closed her eyes, trying to summon Thomas's voice, his laugh, the way he'd call her Ellie with that teasing lilt. But all she could hear was Richard's voice, sharp and venomous. "You let him die." The words echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh wound. She didn't believe them, not really. She'd done everything she could for Thomas, staying by his side through every doctor's visit, every sleepless night, every moment of his pain. But Richard's accusation burrowed into her, feeding on her doubts, her guilt, her fear that she hadn't been enough. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where the world outside was coming to life. Mrs. Henderson, her neighbor, was watering her roses, her straw hat bobbing as she moved. A delivery truck rumbled past, kicking up dust that swirled in the morning light. Life was continuing, oblivious to the fact that Eleanor's world had stopped. She wondered what Mrs. Henderson would say if she knew what had happened last night. Would she believe her? Would anyone? Richard was Thomas's brother, a man known in Willow Creek for his charm when he wasn't drinking, for his quick smile and quicker temper. Eleanor was just the grieving widow, old and worn, her story too ugly to be true. Shame burned in her chest, hot and heavy. She hadn't told anyone about Richard. Not Clara, who was driving in from Columbus for the funeral, not Mabel, her best friend of 30 years, who'd called this morning to check on her. The words were there, lodged in her throat, but they wouldn't come. To speak them would make them real, would force her to face the truth of what had happened. And what if no one believed her? What if they blamed her, saw her as weak, as broken? The thought was unbearable. She stood, her legs unsteady, and shuffled to the sink. The dishes from yesterday's hospice visit were still there, a pile of plates and cups crusted with remnants of soup and tea. She turned on the faucet, letting the water run over her hands, the cold a small shock that grounded her. She scrubbed at a plate, her movements mechanical, her mind replaying the night before. Richard's hands, his rage, the way the floor had felt beneath her as she'd curled into herself, trying to disappear. She scrubbed harder, as if she could wash away the memory, the pain, the blood. The phone rang, shrill and insistent, cutting through the silence. Eleanor flinched, dropping the plate into the sink with a clatter. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, her heart pounding, and crossed the room to the old rotary phone on the wall. The receiver was heavy in her hand, her voice barely a whisper as she answered. "Hello. Mom." It was Clara, her voice thick with worry. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to tell Clara everything, to spill the truth about Richard, to beg her daughter to come now, to hold her and make the world feel safe again. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said, "I'm managing, sweetheart. Just trying to keep busy." Clara sighed, the sound crackling through the line. "I'll be there tomorrow morning, okay? The funeral home called. They're ready to go over the arrangements. I can handle most of it if you want." Eleanor nodded, though Clara couldn't see her. "That'd be fine," she said, her voice flat. "Thank you." "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" Clara pressed. "You sound, I don't know, off." "I'm just tired," Eleanor lied, her fingers tightening around the receiver. "It's been a long night." They talked for a few more minutes, Clara filling the silence with plans for the funeral, her voice a lifeline Eleanor clung to. When they hung up, the cottage felt emptier than before. Eleanor sank back into the kitchen chair, her hands trembling. She wanted to call Clara back to tell her the truth, but the shame was too heavy, the fear too strong. What if Clara didn't believe her? What if she thought Eleanor had provoked Richard, had failed Thomas in some unforgivable way? The day passed in a blur of small tasks, washing dishes, folding laundry, answering the door when neighbors dropped off casseroles and condolences. Each interaction was a performance, Eleanor forcing smiles, nodding at kind words, hiding the bruises beneath her cardigan. Mrs. Henderson brought a lasagna, her eyes soft with pity. "You're so strong, Eleanor," she said, patting her hand. "Thomas was lucky to have you." Eleanor wanted to scream. Strong? She didn't feel strong. She felt like a ghost, drifting through her own life, haunted by Richard's hands and Thomas's absence. But she nodded, thanked Mrs. Henderson, and closed the door, leaning against it as fresh tears fell. By evening, the cottage was filled with the scent of flowers, lilies and roses sent by friends, their petals already curling at the edges. Eleanor sat on the couch, a quilt draped over her shoulders, staring at Thomas's armchair across the room. It was a worn leather thing, its arms polished smooth by years of his touch. She could still see him there, reading the newspaper, his glasses slipping down his nose, a mug of coffee in his hand. The memory was so vivid it hurt, a physical ache that made her clutch the quilt tighter. She thought of the early days of their marriage, when they'd built this cottage with their own hands. Thomas had been so proud, hammering nails into the frame, joking that he was building her a castle. They'd laughed, young and in love, dreaming of a future filled with children and adventures. Clara had come a year later, her cries filling the house with life. They'd faced hard times, crop failures, money troubles, Thomas's heart scare in '85, but they'd always faced them together. Now for the first time Eleanor was alone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the house settling and the distant hum of crickets outside. Eleanor's eyes fell on a small notebook on the coffee table, a gift from Clara last Christmas. She'd meant to use it for recipes, but it was still blank, its pages crisp and untouched. On impulse, she picked it up, her fingers brushing the soft leather cover. She opened it, staring at the empty page, and reached for a pen. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain. "Thomas is gone," she wrote, her handwriting shaky. "I don't know how to do this without him." She paused, the pen hovering over the paper, then continued. "Last night Richard came. He was angry. He hurt me." The words looked stark, too real, but writing them felt like releasing a breath she'd been holding. She kept writing, the pen moving faster, pouring out the pain, the fear, the guilt. She wrote about Thomas's last moments, about Richard's rage, about the blood on the floor and the shame in her heart. When she finally stopped, the page was filled, ink smudged where her tears had fallen. She closed the notebook, her hands trembling, but something had shifted inside her. Writing hadn't erased the pain, but it had given it a shape, a place to exist outside her body. She wasn't ready to tell Clara or Mabel or anyone else, not yet, but she told herself the truth, and that was a start. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of birds, their song sharp and insistent. Her body ached as she rose from the couch, where she'd fallen asleep clutching the notebook. She glanced at Thomas's armchair, half expecting to see him there, but it was empty, the leather cold. She made coffee, her movements slow but deliberate, and sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open before her. She wrote again, this time about Thomas, the way he'd hum off-key while shaving, the way he'd sneak extra sugar into her tea when she wasn't looking. The memories hurt, but they also warmed her, like sunlight breaking through the clouds. Clara arrived that afternoon, her car kicking up dust as it pulled into the driveway. Eleanor watched from the window, her heart lifting at the sight of her daughter's familiar figure, tall and slender, with Thomas's blue eyes and a stubborn streak that was all her own. Clara burst through the door, her arms full of grocery bags, her face etched with worry. "Mom," she said, dropping the bags and pulling Eleanor into a hug. "I'm here." Eleanor clung to her, the warmth of Clara's embrace a balm to her battered spirit. She wanted to tell her everything, to unburden herself of the secret that weighed her down, but the words stayed locked inside. Instead, she said, "I'm so glad you're here, sweetheart." They spent the day planning the funeral, sorting through Thomas's things, deciding which suit he'd wear, which songs would play. Clara was a whirlwind of efficiency, making calls, writing lists, shielding Eleanor from the worst of it. But every so often, Eleanor caught Clara watching her, her eyes searching, as if she sensed something was wrong. Eleanor avoided her gaze, busying herself with small tasks, polishing silverware, folding napkins, anything to keep her hands moving and her mind occupied. That evening, Mabel came by, her arms full of a homemade apple pie, Thomas's favorite. Mabel was a stout woman with a laugh that could fill a room, her gray curls bouncing as she talked. "Eleanor, you look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, setting the pie on the counter. "You need to take care of yourself, you hear?" Eleanor forced a smile, her hand smoothing her cardigan to hide the bruises. "I'm trying, Mabel," she said. "It's just hard." Mabel nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know, honey. Losing someone you love. It's like losing half your heart. But you're not alone. You've got Clara, you've got me, you've got this whole town." The words were kind, but they felt hollow to Eleanor. She wasn't alone, but she felt it, the isolation of her secret wrapping around her like a shroud. She wanted to tell Mabel, to let the truth spill out, but the fear of judgment, of disbelief, held her back. Instead, she cut a slice of pie, the scent of cinnamon and apples filling the kitchen, and handed it to Mabel. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." As the days passed, Eleanor moved through the motions of grief, accepting condolences, organizing the funeral, packing away Thomas's clothes. Each task was a small act of survival, a way to keep the darkness at bay. But at night, when the house was quiet and Clara was asleep in the guest room, Eleanor returned to her notebook. She wrote about the good days with Thomas, the bad days, the ordinary days that she now cherished most of all. She wrote about Richard too, her words raw and unfiltered, a release for the anger and fear she couldn't voice aloud. One night, as she sat by the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, Eleanor found herself writing something new. "I am not broken," she wrote, the words bold and deliberate. "I am hurt, but I am still here. Thomas believed in me, and I will believe in myself." She stared at the page, her heart pounding, and realized it was true. The shame was still there, the grief a constant ache, but beneath it was a spark of something stronger. Resilience, defiance, the will to keep going. She closed the notebook, her hand steady for the first time in days. The weight of silence was still heavy, but it was no longer crushing. Eleanor didn't know how she'd face Richard again, or if she'd ever find the courage to tell her story. But she knew she wouldn't let his cruelty define her. She was Eleanor Miller, widow, mother, survivor. And she was tougher than she knew. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the hardwood floor. It was July 5, 1995, a week since Thomas's death and the night that had shattered her sense of safety. The air was thick with the scent of summer, cut grass, blooming honeysuckle, and the faint tang of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Eleanor stood at the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing the same plate she'd been cleaning for 10 minutes. Her movements were mechanical, a way to keep her body busy while her mind churned. The funeral had come and gone, a blur of black dresses, murmured condolences, and Clara's steady presence at her side. Eleanor had played the part of the grieving widow well, nodding at kind words, accepting hugs, and hiding the bruises that still lingered beneath her long-sleeved blouse. But the weight of her secret, Richard's violence, the blood on the floor, the shame that clung to her like damp cloth, grew heavier with each passing day. She hadn't seen Richard since that night, but his shadow loomed over her, a specter she couldn't escape. Clara had returned to Columbus yesterday, her eyes filled with worry as she hugged Eleanor goodbye. "Call me if you need anything, Mom," she'd said, her voice tight. "I mean it. Anything." Eleanor had nodded, promising to call, but the words she really wanted to say, "Your uncle hurt me, Clara. He broke something in me," remained locked inside. The fear of disbelief, of judgment, of fracturing her daughter's already fragile heart kept her silent. But silence was a prison, and Eleanor was beginning to feel its walls closing in. She'd filled pages in her notebook, the one Clara had given her, with raw, jagged words about Thomas, about Richard, about the woman she used to be and the one she was becoming. Writing had given her a small measure of control, a way to name the pain without letting it consume her. Yet it wasn't enough. She needed more. Someone to help her carry the weight. That morning, as she dried her hands on a faded dish towel, her eyes caught sight of a crumpled flyer on the counter. She'd found it pinned to the bulletin board at the general store a few days ago, its edges curling, the ink smudged from rain. Willow Creek Women's Support Group, it read in bold letters. A safe space for healing. Every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Community Center. Eleanor had tucked it into her purse without thinking, a reflex born of curiosity or desperation. Now, staring at the flyer, she felt a pull, faint but insistent, like a whisper urging her forward. The community center was a short walk from her cottage, down a quiet street lined with maple trees and tidy lawns. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the flyer. What would she say if she went? How could she explain the unexplainable? The thought of sitting in a room full of strangers, baring her soul, made her stomach twist. But the alternative, staying here alone with her grief and her secret, was worse. She folded the flyer and slipped it into her pocket, her decision made before she could talk herself out of it. The day passed slowly, each hour a battle against her own doubts. She busied herself with small tasks, sweeping the porch, watering the geraniums, mending a tear in one of Thomas's old shirts. The shirt smelled faintly of him, a mix of cedar and pipe tobacco, and she held it to her face, breathing deeply, letting the memory of him steady her. Thomas had always believed in her strength, even when she doubted it herself. "You're tougher than you know, Ellie," he'd said, his voice a warm anchor in her mind. She clung to those words now, letting them guide her as she prepared to leave the house. By late afternoon, Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing her hair and adjusting her blouse. She'd chosen a soft green one, long-sleeved to cover the fading bruises, paired with a simple skirt. Her reflection looked older than she remembered, her hazel eyes shadowed, her cheeks hollow. But there was a spark there, too, a glimmer of the woman who'd built a life with Thomas, who'd raised Clara, who'd survived harder days than most. She straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and grabbed her purse. The walk to the community center was quiet, the summer evening warm and still. Children played in a nearby yard, their laughter a sharp contrast to the heaviness in Eleanor's chest. The center itself was a low brick building, its windows glowing with soft light. A sign out front read Willow Creek Community Center. All are welcome, and Eleanor paused, her hand on the door, her heart pounding. She could turn back, retreat to the safety of her cottage, but something, Thomas's voice, her own stubborn will, pushed her forward. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old books, a comforting blend that eased her nerves. The meeting room was at the end of a short hallway, its door propped open with a folding chair. Eleanor hesitated, peering inside. A circle of chairs was arranged in the center, some occupied by women of varying ages, some young, some older than Eleanor, all with faces that carried stories of their own. A table in the corner held a coffee urn, a plate of cookies, and a stack of flyers like the one in her pocket. A woman with short silver hair and warm brown eyes approached, her smile gentle but not pitying. "You must be new," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Sarah, the group facilitator. Welcome." Eleanor shook her hand, her grip tentative. "Eleanor Miller," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw the flyer." Sarah's smile widened. "I'm glad you're here, Eleanor. Come on in, grab some coffee if you like. We're just about to start." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight, and stepped into the room. The other women glanced up, their expressions a mix of curiosity and kindness. She took a seat near the edge of the circle, her hands folded in her lap, her purse clutched like a shield. The room was quiet for a moment, the only sound the hum of the air conditioner and the faint clink of cups on the table. Sarah stood, addressing the group. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice calm and steady. "For those who are new, this is a safe space. We're here to listen, to share, to support each other. There's no pressure to speak, but if you feel ready, we're here for you." The meeting began with introductions, each woman sharing her name and a brief reason for being there. There was Lily, a young mother escaping an abusive marriage, Margaret, a widow grappling with loneliness, and Ruth, a retired teacher healing from a lifetime of suppressed trauma. Their stories were different, but their pain was a common thread, weaving them together in a way Eleanor hadn't expected. When it was her turn, Eleanor's mouth went dry. The words she'd written in her notebook felt too raw, too heavy to speak aloud. But the eyes of the women around her were kind, their silence inviting, not judging. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling in her lap. "I'm Eleanor," she said, her voice low but steady. "My husband, Thomas, passed away a week ago. Cancer. And the night he died, something else happened. His brother." She faltered, the memory of Richard's hands, his rage flooding her senses. The room was quiet, waiting, giving her space. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "He hurt me. Badly. I haven't told anyone, not even my daughter. I don't know how to start." The silence that followed was not empty but full, filled with understanding, with shared pain. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes soft but fierce. "Thank you for sharing, Eleanor," she said. "That took incredible courage. You're not alone here." The air in Willow Creek was heavy with the scent of late summer, a mix of sun-warmed grass and the faint sweetness of overripe apples from the orchard down the road. It was July 20th, 1995, 3 weeks since Thomas's death and the night Richard had shattered Eleanor's sense of safety. The cottage, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, felt like a battleground now, its walls holding memories of both joy and pain. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, staring out at the world that seemed to move on without her. The bruises on her body had faded to yellow-green shadows, but the ones on her soul were still raw. She'd found strength in the support group at the community center, where women like Sarah, Lily, and Ruth had become her anchors, their stories weaving a tapestry of resilience that gave her hope. Sarah's words from the last meeting echoed in her mind. "You deserve justice, Eleanor. And others deserve to be safe from him." The idea of reporting Richard had terrified her at first. Willow Creek was a small town, where gossip spread faster than wildfire, and Richard was Thomas's brother, a man with a charming smile and a reputation that hid his darker side. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized Sarah was right. Silence protected Richard, not her. Eleanor's notebook, now filled with pages of her thoughts and memories, sat on the kitchen table, its leather cover worn from her constant handling. She'd written about Thomas, about the love they'd shared, about the night Richard had hurt her. Each word was a step toward reclaiming her voice, but writing wasn't enough anymore. She needed to act, to face the storm head-on, even if it meant standing alone. Clara had called every day since returning to Columbus, her voice a mix of worry and determination. "Mom, you're not yourself," she'd said last night, her words crackling through the phone line. "I'm coming back this weekend. We need to talk." Eleanor had nodded, though Clara couldn't see, and promised to be okay. But she wasn't okay, not yet. The truth about Richard was a weight she couldn't carry alone, but the thought of telling Clara, of seeing pain or disbelief in her daughter's eyes, made her heart ache. This morning, as the sun climbed higher, Eleanor made a decision. She would go to the police station. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. The thought sent a shiver through her, but it was a shiver of resolve, not fear. She dressed carefully, choosing a navy blouse and skirt, her hands steady as she buttoned the cuffs over the last traces of her bruises. She brushed her gray hair, pinning it back with a simple clip, and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was tired, yes, but there was a fire in her hazel eyes, a spark that hadn't been there a week ago. The Willow Creek Police Station was a small, squat building at the edge of town, its brick facade weathered by years of rain and wind. Eleanor walked there, her purse clutched tightly, her steps deliberate despite the tremor in her legs. The streets were quiet, the only sounds the hum of a lawnmower and the chatter of sparrows in the trees. She passed the general store, where Mr. Thompson was sweeping the sidewalk, and the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread wafted through the open door. Each familiar sight was a reminder of the life she'd built here, the life she was fighting to reclaim. Inside the station, the air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and coffee. A young officer sat at the front desk, his badge reading Officer Daniels. He looked up as Eleanor approached, his expression polite but curious. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "How can I help you?" Eleanor's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "I'd like to report an assault," she said, her voice low but clear. "It happened a few weeks ago, the night my husband died." Officer Daniels's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded, reaching for a notepad. "All right, Mrs. Miller," he said, recognizing her from the small-town grapevine. "Why don't you come with me? We can talk in private." He led her to a small office down the hall, its walls lined with filing cabinets and a single window overlooking the parking lot. Eleanor sat in a hard plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap, as Officer Daniels took a seat across from her. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that put her at ease. "Start from the beginning," he said, his pen poised over the notepad. "Take your time." Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart pounding. The words she'd written in her notebook, the ones she'd shared with the support group, were easier in the safety of those spaces. Here in this sterile room they felt heavier, more real. But she thought of Thomas, of his belief in her strength, and began to speak. "It was June 28th, she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "My husband, Thomas, passed away that night. Cancer. I was with him at home when he took his last breath. Afterward, his brother, Richard Miller, came to the house. He was angry, drunk, blaming me for Thomas's death. He hit me, pushed me, hurt me until I was bleeding on the floor." Officer Daniels's pen moved quickly, his face unreadable but attentive. He asked questions gently. "Where exactly did it happen? What time? What did Richard say?" Eleanor answered as best she could, her voice faltering only when she described the moment she'd thought she might not survive. The memory was vivid, a blur of pain and fear, Richard's hands on her shoulders, his voice a roar in her ears. She told the officer about the blood, the torn dress, the way Richard had left her crumpled on the floor. When she finished, the room was quiet, the only sound the scratch of the pen and the distant hum of a radio. Officer Daniels looked up, his eyes soft with empathy. "I'm so sorry you went through that, Mrs. Miller," he said. "You did the right thing coming here. We'll need to file a report, and I'll talk to my supervisor about next steps. Do you feel safe at home? Has Richard contacted you since?" Eleanor shook her head. "He hasn't come back," she said. "But I don't feel safe. Not yet." Officer Daniels nodded, jotting down a note. "We can look into a restraining order if you want. And we'll bring Richard in for questioning. Based on what you've told me, we have enough to move forward." The words "move forward" echoed in Eleanor's mind, both a promise and a challenge. She thanked the officer, her voice thick with emotion, and left the station feeling lighter, though the weight of what came next pressed against her. The walk home was a blur, her mind replaying the conversation, the act of speaking her truth aloud. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing, like opening a window in a stuffy room. By the time she reached the cottage, the town was buzzing. News traveled fast in Willow Creek, and Eleanor's report was no exception. Mrs. Henderson, her neighbor, stopped by that afternoon with a basket of muffins, her eyes wide with concern. "I heard you were at the police station," she said, her voice low, as if afraid to be overheard. "Is everything all right, Eleanor?" Eleanor hesitated, her instinct to deflect, to hide, still strong. But Sarah's voice from the support group rang in her ears. "You deserve to be heard." She took a breath and said, "No, it's not all right. But I'm trying to make it right." Mrs. Henderson's face softened, and she reached for Eleanor's hand. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to," she said. "But I'm here, you know that." The kindness nearly undid Eleanor, but she held herself together, thanking Mrs. Henderson and promising to call if she needed to talk. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. Some neighbors offered support, dropping off casseroles and flowers, their eyes filled with quiet understanding. Others were less kind, their glances sharp, their voices hushed as they speculated about what really happened. Richard was well liked in certain circles, his charm masking his temper, and Eleanor could feel the weight of their doubt. Clara arrived that weekend, her car pulling into the driveway just as Eleanor was watering the geraniums. She burst through the door, her face pale, her eyes blazing. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "I heard from Mrs. Thompson at the store. She said you went to the police about Uncle Richard. What happened?" Eleanor froze, the watering can slipping from her hands, spilling onto the porch. She'd wanted to protect Clara, to shield her from the ugliness, but the truth was out now, and there was no going back. She led Clara inside, sat her down at the kitchen table, and told her everything. The night of Thomas's death, Richard's rage, the pain that still lingered in her bones and her heart. Clara listened, her hands clenched into fists, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said when Eleanor finished, her voice raw. "I should have been here. I should have known." Eleanor reached across the table, taking Clara's hands. "This isn't your fault, sweetheart," she said firmly. "It's his. And I'm going to make sure he answers for it." Clara stayed the night, sleeping in the guest room, her presence a comfort Eleanor hadn't realized she needed. They talked late into the evening, sharing memories of Thomas, crying and laughing in equal measure. For the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of her secret lift, replaced by the strength of her daughter's love. The court date came a week later, a gray morning with a sky that threatened rain. The Willow Creek Courthouse was a small building, its wooden benches worn smooth by decades of trials and hearings. Eleanor sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Clara sat beside her, her hand a steady anchor on Eleanor's arm. Sarah from the support group was there too, along with Lily and Ruth, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Richard sat across the room, his face pale, his eyes avoiding hers. He'd been arrested days after Eleanor's report, charged with assault based on her statement and the physical evidence she'd preserved. Her torn dress, the photographs of her bruises taken by the police. He'd pleaded not guilty, his lawyer arguing that it was a misunderstanding, that Richard was grieving and drunk, not himself. The words stung, but Eleanor refused to let them shake her. When it was her turn to testify, she stood, her legs trembling but her resolve firm. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. She took the stand, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box, and looked out at the faces watching her. Clara's filled with love, Sarah's steady and encouraging, Richard's cold and unreadable. "Mrs. Miller," the prosecutor began, a kind woman named Miss Carter with sharp eyes and a calm voice. "Can you tell us what happened on the night of June 28th? Eleanor took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "My husband Thomas died that night," she said. I was with him holding his hand when he passed. Afterward, his brother, Richard Miller, came to our house. He was angry, blaming me for Thomas's death. He pushed me, hit me, threw me to the floor. I was bleeding, scared for my life. He left me there alone. The words came easier than she'd expected. Each one a brick in the wall she was building around her truth. Miss Carter asked questions, gentle but thorough, drawing out the details, the time, the place, the words Richard had used. Eleanor answered clearly, her voice growing stronger with each question. When Richard's lawyer cross-examined her, suggesting she'd exaggerated, that her grief had clouded her memory, Eleanor held her ground. I know what happened, she said, her eyes locking onto the lawyer's. I lived it. And I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. The trial was short, as small-town cases often were. The judge, an older man with a stern face but kind eyes, listened carefully, his pen moving across his notes. When it was over, he delivered his verdict. Richard was guilty of assault, sentenced to 6 months of community service and mandatory counseling. It was a light punishment, lighter than Eleanor had hoped, but it was something. A public acknowledgement of his wrong, a step toward justice. As she left the courtroom, Clara's arm around her shoulders, Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The storm wasn't over, not entirely. The town's whispers would continue, and Richard's presence would linger, a shadow she'd have to face. But she'd stood up, spoken her truth, and that was a victory. Sarah hugged her outside, whispering, "You were incredible, Eleanor. You did it." The drive home was quiet, the sky breaking open with rain as they reached the cottage. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the drops fall, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. She wasn't healed, not yet, but she was stronger. She'd faced the storm and come out the other side, still standing, still fighting. And that, she knew, was enough for now.
The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke through Willow Creek, rustling the curtains of Eleanor's cottage as it slipped through the open windows. It was October 15th, 1995, nearly 4 months since Thomas's death, and the night Richard had left her bloodied on the floor. The cottage, once a place of sorrow and fear, was slowly becoming a haven again, its walls warmed by the soft glow of lamplight and the quiet strength of a woman rebuilding her life. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for an apple pie, the recipe one of Thomas's favorites. The air was rich with the scent of cinnamon and sugar, a comforting reminder of the life they'd shared. Her gray hair was tied back with a scarf, and her hazel eyes, though still shadowed by grief, held a spark of determination that hadn't been there in July. The bruises on her body were long gone, but the ones on her heart lingered, a quiet ache that flared in the stillness of the night. Yet she was learning to carry that ache, to weave it into the fabric of her life without letting it define her. The notebook Clara had given her last Christmas sat on the table, its pages now filled with her thoughts, memories, and truths. Writing had become Eleanor's lifeline, a way to process the pain of Thomas's loss and Richard's violence. She'd written about the good days, the summer evenings when she and Thomas danced in the backyard, the mornings Clara would crawl into their bed, giggling as they tickled her. She'd written about the bad days, too. The night Richard had hurt her, the shame that had kept her silent, the fear that had nearly swallowed her whole. Each word was a step toward healing, a way to reclaim her voice and her story. The support group at the community center had become her anchor, a place where she could speak her truth without judgment. Sarah, Lily, Ruth, and the other women had welcomed her into their circle, their stories of survival and strength giving her courage. She'd attended every Wednesday meeting since that first nerve-wracking night, and with each session, she felt a little less alone. They cried together, laughed together, shared coffee and cookies, and built a bond that felt like family. Sarah, the group facilitator, had become a mentor, her quiet wisdom guiding Eleanor through the darkest moments. Tonight, Eleanor was hosting a small gathering for the group, a potluck dinner to celebrate their shared journey. The idea had been hers, born from a desire to give back to the women who'd helped her find her footing. The kitchen table was set with a checkered tablecloth, mismatched plates, and a vase of late-blooming asters from the garden. The pie was her contribution, but Lily was bringing a salad, Ruth a casserole, and Sarah a bottle of her homemade elderberry wine. Clara was coming, too, driving in from Columbus to spend the weekend, her presence a steady comfort in Eleanor's new reality. As the dough came together under her hands, Eleanor thought of Clara, who had become her rock in the months since the trial. Telling Clara about Richard had been one of the hardest moments of Eleanor's life, but it had also been a turning point. Clara's anger at Richard, at herself for not seeing her mother's pain, had given way to fierce protectiveness. She'd moved closer to Willow Creek, renting a small apartment just 20 minutes away, and visited nearly every weekend. They'd spent hours talking, crying, and remembering Thomas, their bond growing stronger with each shared memory. The trial had been another milestone, a storm Eleanor had faced with trembling knees but unwavering resolve. Richard's guilty verdict, though the sentence was light, 6 months of community service and mandatory counseling, had been a victory, a public acknowledgement of her truth. The town's reaction had been mixed, as she'd expected. Some neighbors, like Mrs. Henderson, had rallied around her, offering hugs and casseroles, their support a quiet strength. Others whispered behind her back, questioning her story, clinging to Richard's charm and the myth of his grief-driven mistake. Eleanor had learned to let the whispers slide off her, focusing instead on the people who believed her, who saw her. She slid the pie into the oven, the warmth of it filling the kitchen, and wiped her hands on her apron. The cottage was alive with small touches of renewal, a fresh coat of paint on the living room walls, a new quilt on the couch, a row of potted herbs on the windowsill. Each change was a reclaiming, a way to make the space hers again. Thomas's armchair still sat by the fireplace, its leather-worn but comforting, a reminder of his love that she carried with her. She didn't sit in it, not yet, but she no longer avoided looking at it, either. The doorbell rang, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. She opened the door to find Sarah, her silver hair catching the golden light of the setting sun, a bottle of wine in her hands. "Eleanor, it smells amazing in here," Sarah said, her smile warm. "You've outdone yourself." Eleanor laughed, a sound that felt lighter than it had in months. "It's just pie," she said, stepping aside to let Sarah in. "Come on in, make yourself at home." Lily and Ruth arrived soon after, their arms full of dishes, their voices filling the cottage with chatter and laughter. Lily, the young mother who'd escaped an abusive marriage, was brighter these days, her smile less guarded. Ruth, the retired teacher, carried herself with a quiet dignity, her stories of resilience a beacon for the group. They set their dishes on the table, complimenting the Astors and teasing Eleanor about her knack for making the cottage feel like a home. Clara arrived last, her car pulling into the driveway just as the sky deepened to a soft purple. She burst through the door, her arms wrapped around a loaf of homemade bread, her blue eyes sparkling. "Mom, this place looks incredible," she said, pulling Eleanor into a hug. "You're amazing, you know that?" Eleanor hugged her back, her heart swelling. "I'm trying, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Having you here helps." The dinner was a warm, chaotic affair, the table crowded with food and stories. Sarah poured the wine, its sweet tart flavor a perfect match for the meal. Lily shared a funny story about her son's latest obsession with dinosaurs, and Ruth recounted a trip she'd taken to the coast years ago, her eyes misty with memory. Eleanor listened, her heart full, marveling at the strength of these women, at the way they'd woven their lives together. After dinner, they moved to the living room, settling onto the couch and chairs with mugs of tea. The conversation turned quieter, more reflective. Sarah asked if anyone wanted to share an update, and Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of nerves. She'd spoken at every meeting, each time a little easier, but tonight felt different. This was her home, her space, and the women around her were her chosen family. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," Eleanor said, her voice steady but soft. "These past few months have been the hardest of my life. Losing Thomas, what happened with Richard, it broke something in me. But being with all of you, writing in my notebook, standing up in court, it's helped me find something too. Strength, I guess. Or maybe hope." The room was quiet, the women's eyes on her, filled with understanding. Clara reached for her hand, squeezing gently, and Eleanor continued. I'm not done healing. I don't know if I ever will be, but I want to help others the way you've helped me. I've been talking to Sarah about volunteering at the community center, maybe starting a writing group for women like us. A place to tell our stories, to heal through words. Sarah's eyes lit up. That's a wonderful idea, Eleanor, she said. Your voice, your story, it's powerful. It could inspire so many others. Lily nodded, her voice soft but firm. You've already inspired me, she said. Seeing you stand up to Richard, hearing you talk about Thomas. It makes me believe I can keep going too. Eleanor's throat tightened, tears prickling her eyes. She hadn't realized how much her journey had meant to others, how her courage had rippled outward. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and tears, the women sharing their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. As they left, each one hugged Eleanor, their embraces a promise of continued support. Clara stayed behind, helping with the dishes as the cottage grew quiet. I'm so proud of you, Mom, she said, her hands submerged in soapy water. You're stronger than I ever knew. Eleanor smiled, drying a plate with a soft cloth. I got it from your father, she said, and from you. That night, after Clara had gone to bed, Eleanor sat on the porch, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. The sky was a canvas of stars, their light sharp and clear, like the hope she felt growing inside her. She thought of Thomas, of the love they'd shared, of the woman she'd become in his absence. The pain of that terrible night with Richard would always be there, a scar on her heart, but it no longer defined her. She was Grandma Eleanor, widow, mother, survivor, and now a light for others in the dark. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor threw herself into her new role at the community center. She started the writing group, a small gathering of women who met every Tuesday to share their stories through prose and poetry. The group grew quickly, drawing women from Willow Creek and beyond, each one carrying her own burdens, her own triumphs. Eleanor guided them with a gentle hand, encouraging them to write their truths, to find healing in the act of creation. Her notebook became a teaching tool, its pages shared with those who needed to see that survival was possible. The cottage, too, continued to transform. Eleanor painted the bedroom a soft lavender, hung new curtains, and planted a row of sunflowers along the fence, their bright faces a reminder of resilience. She invited Clara and the support group over often, filling the house with laughter and love. Thomas's armchair remained by the fireplace, a quiet presence she was learning to cherish rather than mourn. One evening, as winter approached and the air grew crisp, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her notebook open before her. She wrote about the stars, about Thomas's smile, about the women who'd become her sisters. She wrote about the storm she'd faced and the dawn that had followed. When she finished, she closed the notebook, her hands steady, her heart full. The journey wasn't over, but she was no longer afraid of it. She was Eleanor Miller, and she was ready for whatever came next.